Om Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murtibheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshinamurtaye Namaha. Okay, so there are some nice questions here. Look at that. The first one, so chapter 1, verse 8, commentary. Krishna was so impressed with Bhishma's strength that he took up his chakra. We know Krishna promised not to fight. Why did he not resist this? It looks like a threat, and sure enough, that action had caused Bhishma to give up at the end. What Krishna did was adharma. Krishna also went back on his word, which was considered very important in keeping up with dharma. Bhishma was also a very strong fighter, and he lost his guts because of what Krishna had done. Is this fair? What happened to dharma? So, this is, means a question is fair. Okay, question is fair. So here, in order to really look at this, understand this, we need to be clear about what is dharma. What is dharma? So one thing, when we talk of dharma, there are two types of dharma. Dharma is of two kinds. One is called samanya or universal. One is vishesha. So universal dharma is like satyam, for example, speaking the truth, the universal. And then the other dharma, the individual, is we have our own individual of ideas of what is right and wrong. Okay. So the universal right and wrong applies to everybody, all humanity, every human beings. The particular individual right and wrong, particular means can apply to, because not all of humanity has the same idea of right and wrong contextually. So depending on that, what was considered right 1,000 years ago may not be considered right now. So what was considered right in one place in the world, in one culture, in one society, may not be considered right in another place at another time. So if you go to a temple in the north, so they cover their head. In the south, they uncover their head. If you go to a church, you have to uncover your head. If you go to a mosque, you have to cover your head. What is right in this? Is there a right or a wrong? So there is a right and a wrong. But depending on the context, it's not like universal. It doesn't apply to everybody, So like that, there is a universal right and wrong, and there is a particular right and wrong, time, place, society, culture, and so on. That is one thing. This is important. The second thing which is important is when it comes to right and wrong, dharma, universal. Even though dharma may be universally right, okay, in the sense it applies to all of humanity, like speaking the truth, it is still relative. Dharma is not absolute. That is how we understand in our culture. Dharma is not absolute. It's relative. Because it's a relative world, Dharma is choice between right and wrong. There's choices for human being. First of all, doesn't apply to animals. Because human beings can choose. So when you're making choices, even within right and, because everything in the world is relative. When you look at anything in the world is relative. There's no absolutes, you know. So relative, when you say, it is the context. A given context defines what is right and wrong. Okay. So this is broadly the basic thing about dharma that we should know, how we see it, how we understand it. Now coming to a particular, so when I'm trying to understand a particular incident, event, so this is the broad context. Now here what happened? So Sri Krishna made a promise, or he said that he is not going to fight. That was his decision. Okay. So I'm not even sure that he took an oath that I'm not going to fight. He said, I will not fight. This army and me, if I come there, I will not fight the war. Okay. So anyway, but he picked up the chakram as though he was going to fight. Okay. Obviously, that's the point, you know. So whether he was going to fight or not, we don't know. He didn't really fight. Okay. So he picked up the chakra. So as though he might fight. Okay. As though he might. That was a message. That's correct. The message, he gave a message to Bhishma and other people standing around that I am ready to give up, go past, transgress my own commitment to not fight, if it comes to that. If it comes to that. When he did that, even though he may not have had any intention of fighting, okay, it's like when you are taking care of your child, you know, and then not listening, and then what do? So you lift up your hand, you know, lift up your hand. You have no intention of hitting your kid. You never hit your kid. You don't believe in it, but you lift up your hand. Then, so the child thinks that I'm going to be hit, and it stops whatever it's doing. Okay. Anyway, does that justify what you did? Because you went against what you believe in. Okay. So anyway, so that is something which is debatable. Maybe you should not even do that. Not even make a threat. You know, even to make a threat is wrong. Whether you act upon it or not, you make a threat is wrong. So, well, but then you say, oh, you know, this situation was really totally out of hand. Other things were going to happen, which would have been worse, etc. All those things are there. Okay. In any case, here Sri Krishna did something which he said he was not going to do, which maybe he would not have done either. We don't know. But it set forth a series of events. Is what he did, was it right, or was it wrong? What is dharma or was it adharma? Well, you can debate this forever. But the point is, suppose it is wrong. Okay, he should have kept his word. Okay, that he was not going to fight. Even though he did not break his word, he still acted as though he was going to break his word. Okay. So now, it was wrong. You can say it was wrong. And it was wrong. So relatively speaking, it was wrong. From one standpoint, it was wrong. But from another standpoint, perhaps he did not have a choice at that point. You know, did not have a choice. You know, it's interesting because in dharma, this is what happens. Sometimes the choices, I'll talk about that. We'll come in the context of other question also. But the choice is not always between right and wrong. Sometimes the choice is between two things which is both are wrong. Both are wrong. In terms of what is going to happen, you know. And then you make a choice. He made a choice. So in the choice, if he made a wrong choice, it is still wrong. It's not right. the choice may be right in the sense there was no other choice for him at that point. But then, if from one standpoint that it was wrong, it was still wrong. From the standpoint of the fact that he had said he would not do it and he did something which he said he would not do. He will never said, I will not pick up a weapon. He said, I will not fight. Okay. So this all gets into that, the gray zone. But a wrong is a wrong, and the consequence also will be there. It's not that a wrong choice or a wrong action from some standpoint will have a consequence also. So interesting also is this he does to Bhishma. He didn't do to Dronacharya. He didn't do this to Karna. There were several instances in Mahabharata war that entered this gray zone, which looked right and wrong depending on which way you look at it. Yeah. But then there you make a choice. You make a calculated choice. And the wrong still remains a wrong. The right still remains a right from a given standpoint. And each of them will have a consequence. That's the message when we try to understand dharma. So I'm saying it was interesting that he chose to do this with Bhishma. Because this whole question of he made a commitment. Bhishma was a person who made a great commitment. Okay. So this commitment that he made was that he would support, he would always protect the throne. He would protect the throne. He made that commitment. He took a vow. Okay, he took a vow. Now that when Duryodhana became the ruler, so why did Bhishma fight on the side of Kauravas, right? This is another question people wonder. The Bhishma was the senior most person in the family. He was the strongest and the bravest among all in those times. And whichever side he fought on, really that side was going to win. He was such a great warrior. And he had made, why did he choose this Kaurava side, which was wrong? This adharma, represented adharma. Well, because he felt he had no choice. And the reason he had no choice was because he took this vow to protect the throne. But when he took that vow, it did not cross his mind that the person who would be occupying the throne would be such an adharmic person. So he was bound by his vow. Was bound by his vow. So he ended up on the wrong side. And he ended up on the side of adharma. The question, there's another whole question. Did he do the right thing or did he do the wrong thing? Well, he should have broken his vow and fought for dharma. But he kept his vow and fought for adharma. Then was that right? What was right there for him? Well, right or wrong, he fought for adharma and he had its consequence. As consequence, he lost his life. Okay. So the point in dharma, adharma always is that dharma, adharmas are relative. And when they are relative, it is defined by the context. But right is right, wrong will be wrong. Just because sometimes we choose an action, if a choice is between two wrong things and there is no other choice, I have to choose one. And then I choose something which is wrong. Then I say, well, I had no other choice. So does it make it right or does it make it wrong if I have no other choice? Well, perhaps The choice is right because you have no other choice, but then the wrong is still wrong. It will have its consequence. So knowingly I'm doing it, knowingly I know the consequence, and I'm ready for it then. I'm ready for it. That is how we understand dharma, adharma. We don't have to try and justify it. So perhaps he should not have done that because he made the promise. But technically, he didn't really fight. You can argue that. But then he made a threat. Well, he'll say, I didn't make a threat. I mean, this argument, there are many ways to argue both. But from a certain context, it was wrong. From a certain context, there was no choice for him in his mind at that time. So he took that action. Yeah. That's how we understand dharma, dharma. Dharma, dharma, right, wrong is always relative when it comes to anything to do with the world. It is defined by the context. But what the problem with us is, we just because sometimes we make a wrong choice, knowingly, we can't call it right. It's still wrong. And the consequence is not going to be, you won't get punyam out of it. Sri Krishna also did. He, as a human being, then he had to. His life also had its own ups and downs. So, from a relative standpoint, I think that should. Dharma, while being universal, is relative. It's always relative. That's the important message. Yeah. Okay. Another question. Does one have to study the Mahabharata in order to study the Bhagavad Gita? Well, you know, okay. So what is Mahabharata and what is Bhagavad Gita? The Mahabharata is the story of Pandavas, Kuru Vamsha, the Kuru family. So it's their story. The whole of the Mahabharata is considered to be a itihasa, a historical poem based on some events, but which are reported. But it is written in the form of a poetry. So in poetry, there are always, the poetic language again is different. In poetry, there is a lot of things are embellished, to draw the attention of the people. And there is things are exaggerated sometimes to highlight certain points. So, but what is important is the message. So Mahabharata is the whole context of this. It's a big story. In this, there is Bhagavad Gita. One small, tiny portion of it is Bhagavad Gita. A particular dialogue. There are thousands of dialogues that happen in Mahabharata. This one particular dialogue, is the one between Sri Krishna and Arjuna, which stands out because of the nature of the dialogue. Okay. And this dialogue basically is almost like an Upanishad. The Upanishad in the Vedas. So, because Upanishads in the Vedas are mostly in the form of a dialogue between a teacher and a student, talking about the ultimate truths that have to do with the individual, the world, and Bhagavan, the cause of everything. So these kinds of dialogues are there in the Veda in the form of Upanishads. This is what constitutes our scripture. Bhagavad Gita is such a dialogue. that occurred at a given moment in the whole big life of this epic of Mahabharata. So Bhagavad Gita is looked upon, it's almost like an Upanishad, and given the same kind of status and respect as a Veda, as a scripture. So we study the Bhagavad Gita. We study the Bhagavad Gita. Now, does one have to study the Mahabharata like you study the Bhagavad Gita? No, really, no. One doesn't have to. And it's not going to be easy either. So just see how long it's going to take you to study Bhagavad Gita. Okay. 18 chapters. Now imagine having to study like that the whole Mahabharata. Obviously, it's not a joke. It's a lifetime work to do that. Even Bhagavad Gita is a lifetime work to study. So one doesn't have to study the whole Mahabharata or know the details of Mahabharata when you're trying to study or understand the message of Bhagavad Gita. But the context is important. Well, Bhagavad Gita, it's written in a certain context. So what is happening, even in Mahabharata, there is a particular incident of this war, and that is what forms the context, the smaller context of this scripture of Bhagavad Gita. So the context we have to understand. As long as you understand the context, it's fine. That's why you see when you study, there was almost like a whole several pages. So trying to give the context in terms of what was happening. And in that context, this Bhagavad Gita is given. So that's important to understand what the context is. Because once the teaching starts, really speaking, you don't see any much said about any of the characters of the Kauravas or Pandavas. All those things don't come in Bhagavad Gita. The whole dialogue has to do with Arjuna, Sri Krishna, and Sri Krishna explaining to him about life, about values, about Atma, about the means of gaining this knowledge, all those kinds of things. The whole dialogue is about spiritual matters. It's not about the family or the story or even the war that they are supposed to be in the middle of. So none of that you see in Bhagavad Gita, okay, except for the context that is created in the first chapter. You can as well begin, the teaching begins only from the second chapter onwards. So Ashocyan Anvashochastvam, like that is exactly where the teaching begins. Or perhaps when Arjuna asks the question, Karpanya doshaha, like that, when he starts, you can say that actual teaching begins from there. Because don't forget, the Bhagavad Gita is not a separate, it's part of the Mahabharata. Only these verses taken out of there. So the first chapter is just showing us the background context. But the actual teaching, that's why in the commentary of Adi Shankaracharya, he actually begins his commentary. He doesn't even have a commentary for the first chapter. He begins his commentary only from the second chapter onwards, So that's the context. Okay, next question. In Brahma Sutra Bhashya, Adi Shankara says that Shudras and women are not qualified for Vedic knowledge. Is this true? Almost all the students in this class are women, and the above statement is alarming. Yeah. It's true, alarming. Yeah, it's just alarming. I don't know how Brahma Sutra quotation came here. I don't know exactly. When you write like that, it's nice to give me a reference where exactly you're getting this from. But in any case, this is a question. So important question, is a legitimate question. So we are under this impression, it says Shudras and women are not qualified for Vedic knowledge. So let's first understand this question. So when we say Vedic knowledge, what do you mean by Vedic knowledge? What are women or certain people? Anybody? Why women? Just any human being. Is any human being excluded from Vedic knowledge? Right? That's a fair question. Maybe a woman, maybe community, Shudra, maybe another religion, maybe some other race, whatever it may be. If you say Vedic, this knowledge is a fundamental knowledge, it applies to every human being, then are certain human beings denied of this knowledge? In our culture itself, look at it. Are they denied of this knowledge? So, what is this knowledge about? This is a knowledge about the individual, it's a knowledge about God, it's a knowledge about the manifest world, it is a knowledge about relationship between all these three, how to gain closeness to Ishvara, to the Lord, what are the different means, etc. This is all the knowledge is about, right? There is no other here secret or mystery. This is simply thing every human being can know and feel fulfilled. That is Vedic knowledge. Okay. There is no other Vedic knowledge. This is the basic Vedic knowledge. So now the question is anyone deprived of this knowledge? I would say no. Nobody in this world, no human being, no gender, irrespective of any background, is deprived of this knowledge. What about in our culture? Well, I don't think they are deprived in our culture either. This knowledge is all over. It's all over our culture, our traditions. So this knowledge, that when you say knowledge, I'm not talking of one particular book. I'm talking of this knowledge, like the knowledge of mathematics. Is any human being denied of the knowledge of mathematics? They may be denied an opportunity to study. You lock up the fellow and don't let him read. Even then, you can't stop him from figuring this out, that 1 + 1 is 2. Okay. So knowledge cannot be denied from anyone. So is it available? The next question is it available? You don't let a fellow go to school, etc. Then you're not making it available. Well, I would say Vedic knowledge is available. It is available in the Vedas. It is available in the Puranas. Have any of you read Puranas? Puranas are stories. They are full of dialogues. They are full of prayers. Thousands of them. Thousands of them. Read any one. Read anyone. See what it says. Does it say anything different from what is said in Bhagavad Gita? Does it say anything different from what is said in the Veda? What is said in the Upanishad? Puranas are there. Stories are there. Our culture is there. Prayers are there. Temples are there. Read a prayer. Are the words of a prayer any different from the words that are there in Gita? In the Veda? They are not. This knowledge is there in the way we do things. The way all our actions are determined by our thinking, our values. All the choices, the way we live, the way we interact, the choices we make in life, our way of life, Every culture is all defined by what we value, what our philosophy of life is. It pervades everywhere. You look and you think and you understand, and the knowledge is there. Knowledge is there. No, 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 but we are not allowed to read this Veda in a certain way. Okay. So then the question is not that anybody is deprived of Vedic knowledge. I first want to make that clear. The knowledge that is there in the Veda pervades every aspect of our culture, our society, our religion, our prayers, our stories, our art forms. It's just there all over. If one chooses to try and understand it. Once you understand it, you can't not see it anywhere. So it's true. I would first clarify that. I would not say this Vedic knowledge or the what is contained in the knowledge or the message that is there in the knowledge, anyone is deprived of. It's there around us. Now there are certain things. How is this? What is the vehicle by which this knowledge is communicated? And this vehicle is at many different levels. Some is simple, like I just explained, in the terms of culture and so on. People imbibe. You ask any uneducated person, you go to a village in India, somebody who never went to school, never had any formal chance for education, a poor man, perhaps even a beggar on the street. You ask him, hey, I want to ask you your opinion, your thought about one question. Can you please answer me? I will say, okay, I'll give you some 10 rupees. You say, okay, sir. He say, can you tell me where is God? You know what he'll say? More likely than not, 9 out of 10 times, I'm sure. He'll say, oh, God, Bhagwan is everywhere. He will say, hey, Bhagwan is everywhere. How did you know this? Because this is something which is a big secret said in the Veda. Bhagwan is Sarva Vyapi, etc. Then how did you find out? You never went to school, you don't have any background. What is? No, sir. Everybody, my grandfather used to say this one used to say that one used to say that. I don't understand it, but he is everywhere. Okay. That is what knowledge. Okay, so it's at different levels. This kind of, it is he, without knowing, he says the right thing. That is there that is Vedic knowledge. He himself doesn't realize it. Then there are others who have they know their exposure to, he went and saw some dramas. He picked up some things from there. There is Itihasa, there is Puranas, etc. Now, Veda is considered the scripture, the direct scripture. Certain prayers and so on are there in the Vedas. Upanishad knowledge is there. These Vedas have a certain degree of sanctity. And they have a certain degree of sanctity because, so any vehicle of communication undergoes drastic changes in society, the ways in which we communicate, the ways in which we express ourselves. Now you find all this text, you're saying this Vedic knowledge is now available on Google, right? It's available on Google. Does it say Google, please, special password for men? Special password for, now no password for women. You have to tell what sex you are, gender. Only then you can enter the file. Is there all over? All over. Would you say now that nowadays this Vedic knowledge is nobody is deprived of Vedic knowledge of the Vedas, because Vedas you can find on Google. So this question is not valid anymore. The Veda knowledge doesn't have to be hidden. Nobody has to be physically deprived of Vedic knowledge to keep it a secret. That's another important thing to know. Because you can read it 100 times and still not understand. That's a interesting secret, that I'm repeatedly told, it's like repeatedly you keep telling somebody a secret and they don't get it. That is Vedic knowledge is like that. So it doesn't have to be kept from somebody. If you really want to keep it as a secret, which only a few people should know. In fact, it is told so openly that people don't get it. Now, the Veda have a certain status because we have maintained it in our culture in its original form. Its original form. Other means of communication, etc., change. I'm telling you, even now, physically, Vedas are available online. You can Google it and read it. Okay. But still, people won't understand what it says. That is the nature of language and of knowledge, because it needs a certain kind of a mind. So the means of communication always change in society. But the knowledge as it is there in the Veda, in that particular language, in that particular form, has been protected in our culture without undergoing changes. You know how many versions, there are other scriptures also in this world. You know how many versions are there of that scripture? Take the Bible. You know how they have this version, they have that version, they have this version, they have different versions. Over a period of time, written by different people, some modifications in language, modifications in perhaps some words, modifications in ideas. Translations, and it's like a translation almost, So there are different versions. But the Veda, the humanity, people, our ancestors took special effort to keep it unchanged because of the nature of the knowledge, They found it so deep and so complete. And they protected even to the extent of the way we recite, the way we chant. And that required a tremendous amount of discipline and commitment on part of the people who did that, who studied it. You recite, even of the way I recite Rudram today, one can say with almost full certainty that 5,000 years ago, our ancestors recited in the same way. You can't say that for other things, because there is a certain way you do it and you don't do it any other way. And it will take weeks to learn how to recite. And that has to be learned. So you sit down with somebody and you learn. You can't learn it on Google. You can listen to 100 YouTubes about Rudram chanting. You will not learn Rudram chanting on YouTube because you don't hear your own mistake to correct it. So it required a certain kind of commitment. It required daily study. Nitya karma it is. So called Vedadhyayanam, study of the Vedas, is a daily duty. So only some people could take this on. The general population cannot take on this kind of commitment. And so it requires a daily study. There's a lot of sanctity. It involves a life of commitment, a life of prayer, there are a lot of associated things with it. So which only few people could make that kind of commitment. And those people were the ones who, so it became very restrictive. The study of the Veda became restrictive because it required a lot of that kind of commitment to maintain it, to study it properly. Not everyone becomes a musician, Find classical music. It requires a commitment. You go to a teacher, they will say, every day you have to practice 4 hours, 5 hours. Can you do that? Are you ready to do that? Does your lifestyle allow you to do that? So this is all called acharam. So there were certain acharams associated with the study of the Veda. And so those were difficult for everybody to follow. One of the important aspects of acharam, so that acharam, different things are there, in daily lifestyle that one follows. So if people were not able to do that, those who were not able to do, did not make that kind of commitment. This is the nature of society. Okay. This is not a fight about individual rights. Here, the world around you is dropping with virus, and here in this country, people are fighting about the individual right: wear a mask or don't wear a mask. Why should I not go and party with 100 people? It's my individual right. Hey, you could infect so many, so this is not about individual rights. It's about choosing to do certain things. A person willing to go out there and make a commitment and study. And women did that, men did that. Everybody did that in earlier days. You look at the stories in the Upanishads. There were great women who taught their husbands. This is one story. There was a husband who taught his wife this teaching, this knowledge. So this knowledge was accessible in a certain way. Now it's accessible, but knowledge has always been accessible. So that's why they say for women, because they were not able to follow these kinds of acharams, because of other responsibilities and so on. So they restricted themselves, really speaking. If you grow up in that culture and you understand the values, you understand the lifestyle, then there was nobody sitting there. We didn't have a police like some religions do. What you wear, what you don't wear. You don't need a law enforcement for that. We didn't have any law enforcement which sat down and say, hey, who are you teaching? Who are you not teaching? But if somebody didn't have a commitment, they didn't teach them. You won't find a teacher who will sit and teach unless you're ready to make a commitment. And there were teachers who were men, there were teachers who were women. Nowadays, there's nobody there to make a commitment, to learn like that. Even people who study the Vedas also go to school and colleges to get a job. Even they can't make a commitment like that. The world is like this now. But don't for a minute think that this knowledge is not available. This knowledge is all pervasive where our culture is concerned. And you will see this as you study. Then you see how it manifests in everything, in what we do. So it was never the case of Vedic knowledge being deprived. It was more a case of, how our attitude towards the scripture and how we chose to maintain it, and the commitment to its sanctity, to preserve as it is, which includes recitation, learning. But the study, the details is there. You study Bhagavad Gita, you're studying the Veda, really speaking. It's like any other dialogue in the Upanishads. Still doesn't mean that one can't go there and read it. It's not like that. There were always men, women, everybody was taught. You see this, the all our ancient texts and Upanishads, Vedas, they are full of stories like that. The teacher wouldn't even ask the background of the student. There were teachers like that. So anyway, so that is so nobody was considered unqualified. So we can't say that, yeah. Okay, next one. To do what is right versus what is pleasant is not possible in all situations. What should one do when choices have to be made? Okay, I'll do this next time because a little bit I have to explain also. Yeah, the real choice is not between what is right and what is pleasant. The real choice is between what is right and what is wrong. So anyway, I'll explain. I'll define this question and then explain it also. I will do that next time. In the meanwhile, we have a few minutes. If you have any particular questions about this, we could look at that. Otherwise, we can come. Okay, good. Very important questions. Yeah. Shall we stop then? Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om.
Thank you, Dhiraj-ji.
Namaskaram.
Thank you.
See you next time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dhiraj.